Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. It's been a long time, but guess what? I'm back! I am finally back with a brand new update on the hand cycle. It's been an absolutely incredible journey to get here. I've learned a lot about myself and I've learned a lot about what it takes to actually engineer and build a product from scratch. But that is all to come. From right now, we've got to take a step back and see what it took to inspire me to build this product in the first place. Let's talk design, because that's the obvious first step. I need some kind of frame, which I'm going to build out of a solid steel bar. Up the front then, I need some kind of suspension system to connect the wheels to the frame. And up the back, I need something similar, like that. Then in between that, I need a seat and some kind of steering column so I can get on the bike and ride. For the main frame of this project, I decided to use a piece of 50mm square steel, mostly because it was easily available and the aluminium I had originally planned to use was not. Unfortunately, it was slightly rusty, but I cleaned it up nicely with a flat disc on an angle grinder. Once it was cleaned up, I began welding it together. Unfortunately, turns out welding gives off a lot of stuff that cameras don't like, and my camera stopped working, so I unfortunately failed to film that. But with the main part of the frame done, it was time to attach the steering column. But I first had to press fit a bearing into the end in order to allow me to steer. With the bearing fitted, I welded it to the base of the frame before continuing on to weld a mount for the motor to the other end. Unfortunately, at this point, I did have to cut my frame in half, which was more difficult than it probably should have been, because I didn't have a way to fit it on my main saw, so I had to cut it with a 100mm angle grinder. Why did I have to cut my frame in half, you might be wondering? Well, basically, long story short, I forgot to attach the suspension mount in position before I welded that bar on the end, and I thought might as well cut it here, because it'll be easier. With that completed, I went on to welding a seat and a box for the battery. I did this out of 3mm steel, but I was able to weld it pretty securely, and I think it'll be plenty strong enough. I then secured this to the frame as best as I could. With the frame done, I gave it a final coat of paint, and then covered it in a protective wrap. Now this is a type of wrap you'd find in the bed of a utility vehicle. It's not particularly pretty, but it's very, very resistant to wear. Right, we've built a frame, but unless I want to go very fast down a steep icy slope, I'm going to need some kind of wheels. And before I can attach wheels, I need suspension, which is what I've designed here. I've gone for a double wishbone design, and I custom designed it for this project. Basically, it allows the wheels to stay parallel as they go up and down, and is a very simple and cost-effective design. What I love about double wishbone suspension is how amazingly simple it is, yet how well it works. Basically, you have two arms which are the same length, and they will keep the two ends completely parallel. In this case, the center and the wheel mount. And it works all the time. Unless one of your arms bends, they will always be exactly parallel, or as close as you can get with your skills on a machine. This specific suspension system uses the same arms on both top and bottom. That way it's easier and cheaper for me to have it manufactured. These arms then connect to basically some kind of knuckle on the end, which connects to the steering. You'll notice that the steering is actually offset slightly behind the axis which it pivots around. This way the wheels will automatically align when I lean around a corner, and should make steering slightly easier. As for the rear suspension, I'm basically planning to steal that off a dual suspension mountain bike and just mount that in some way to my frame. I think this should work pretty well and give me a pretty decent frame.
As easy as it sounds for me to attach the new suspension, it really wasn't, because I had to make a mount that perfectly matched the original bike frame. Of course that wasn't straight. Fortunately, I'm quite good with the calipers and ended up measuring it perfectly, and it all worked out in my favour. The rear suspension done, it was time to move on to the front suspension system. And as I mentioned earlier, I did have to custom design this. Now, this suspension system is designed to be nice and strong and low maintenance. But in the event I do have to do maintenance, I made it as easy as possible for myself. It uses all the same sized Allen keys and spanners, as well as the same bearings wherever possible. There are actually only 2 variations of bearings in the entire system. That being said, the way it mounts is by a clamp design, and if you're an idiot like me and you forget to do that clamp before you put the bolts in, well, it can be very difficult to get the bolts in because the 2 halves aren't aligned. Fortunately though, I did eventually come to my senses, push it together, and then screw in the bolt that clamps it together. You know how I mentioned this uses the same size nuts for everything? Yeah, that's great. Until you lose your 13mm spanner, in which case you use the fingers and hope that the resistance against the metal is enough that it doesn't come apart. With that done, I moved on to the ends, where I attached the bit that attaches the steering. It probably has a proper name on cars and things. It's my project, I'll call it the bit that attaches the steering. I then attached the steering mechanism to the bit that attaches the steering, and attached it using an 8mm bolt with an M6 head. Before moving on to the brakes. Now the brakes are something really special, because on a normal bike both brakes are on the same side. However, when it comes to tricycles, you have one caliper that needs to be effectively mirrored, and that's not something that's very commonly available. I could either buy it Chinese or pay Shimano an extortionate amount of money. I decided to buy the Chinese version, which may have been a mistake in hindsight because I had a couple of problems with it. The first being that the spacing was wrong, so I had to use some JB Weld to attach a washer. For our wheels and tyres, we're going to be using Shimano wheels with Schwalbe Knobby Nick tyres. With the suspension done, I moved on to the steering rods. I started by hammering a piece of aluminium pipe inside a piece of steel pipe. I then cut this precisely to length. I then hammered a piece of threaded rod down the centre of this, which was precisely 2 inches longer than the piece of steel. This was so I could screw some rod end bearings onto the end of it, and they would have just enough thread to clamp down really, really tightly, which is important because you don't want play in your steering. I then machined a block, which would attach to the bottom of the steering column to allow me to steer. This was easy, you're probably thinking. Just cut out a piece of 70-75 aluminium, and yeah, just make it within a 0.1mm tolerance, and, you know, screw down properly. Oh wait, no, this is the worst material to work with. It's like as hard as steel, and it's almost impossible to mill at any kind of speed, so this took hours, and I'm not even exaggerating there. My absolute hatred of 70-75, I decided it was better to let someone else do the top bit of the steering column. This is where the pedals attach, so I had PCBWay make me this part, and it secures in position using a grub screw, which was obviously too long, but we'll cut it down at some point, I think. I'll probably forget. Into our block, we then inserted this modified set of Holotech cranks. How are they modified? Well, they have to both be the same way.
Come to that point in the video where I have to build a drivetrain and somehow power this thing. Up the top here we have our cranks on the top of our steering column, and at the back here we have a drivetrain that you would find on a bike with the motor here and a derailleur and cassette back there. The difference between this and a bike is the cranks are here and the motor's there, and I somehow have to convert the motion of this to the motion of spinning the motor and getting it to move.
My idea here is very simple. We run a chain off the back of our gear. We then change the direction of that chain and run it along the frame under the seat to a second chainring connected to our motor. From this chainring we do exactly the same thing in the opposite direction and connect the chain back up to the top to our gears. When it comes to this small gear, there's virtually no strain on it, so I'm just going to use the cog from a derailleur. However, for the two larger gears, I'm going to have to use something a little bit more substantial. So my plan there is to cut the arm off a crank and only use the spider. The motor we're going to be using is the Bafang BBS02B. This is a 48 volt motor which is available up to 750 watts. We programmed this motor to work off 250 watts with a maximum speed of 25 kilometers an hour so that it remains within the legal limits. With the motor in position, I secured the gears for the chain run and used the cut-off crank as a spider at the front. The smaller gear actually proved to be slightly more difficult because this had to be put in place while the chain was in position, which was easier said than done, to say the least. But I did eventually manage to get it, and I secured it in place with a 6mm nut, and then double locked that with a nylock nut to make it more secure. I then welded up a rack, spray painted it, and secured it to the bike. And with that, it was done.
I know some of you are probably worried about me. I'm absolutely fine. I had a couple of minor scratches, but that's literally it. The hand cycle protected me pretty well in the fall. Now you're probably thinking, a wheel coming off, that's pretty bad. But it's actually not as bad as you think. So the wheel steering mechanism is held on with a bolt that looks like this. Now the one from my hand cycle looks like this. Notice the difference. It's considerably shorter. Well, basically, it just snapped. So, moving forward, we're going to be replacing the stainless bolt with some of these 912 high tensile bolts, which should completely mitigate that issue. Let's get that changed and head back out there. That worked amazingly well. So much better than I was actually expecting. You know, I thought when I set out on this project I'd create a hand cycle that worked. It never occurred to me that I'd create something that was so good and so much fun to ride. Off camera, I've actually taken it on some longer rides, and the range is about 75 kilometers from a full battery to empty. So it's definitely enough for if I wanted to ever go on some longer trips. I wonder what that could be a spoiler for. But this definitely isn't going to be the last you've ever seen of this hand cycle. I'm going to be bringing it back in the future, maybe some modifications, maybe the possibility that I might take it on a longer trip. So until then, have a good time and see you next week.